Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is September 14th, 2021. I'm Matt Van Valkenburg, a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to our lecture. By way of reminder, lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We especially thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea. Without your membership, we would not be able to host this lecture series. We would love to have you join us. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support the world's first and oldest Korean studies organization. For 121 years, we have strived to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. Members receive our annual journal Transactions. Members of RAS Korea are also recognized reciprocally by most of Asia's RAS-affiliated societies, as well as the London-based Original RAS. See our website at raskb.com for details. A link will be posted in the chat box. If you are not a member, we request a one-time admission fee. Please refer to the donation page for more information. And we are joined tonight by Becky White, though Becky's job titles have spanned everything from magazine editor to fashion model. The thread that weaves through all her work is the love of telling a good story and a creative challenge. She is a multifaceted artist working as a producer for the Sky City media team, a videographer for the organization Korean American Story, and a voice actress. Her most well-known title is the creator and director of the Happy Project YouTube channel and podcast, a part research, part art project that is dedicated to exploring, studying, and archiving the experiences of mixed Koreans, ethnically or culturally, around the world. She will discuss Korea's inevitable diversification, what that means, how our fight with discrimination is unique, and how the story of half Koreans is at the foundation. Photojournalist Lee Jae Gab, who first captured the images of half Koreans after the war, heard these final words from his friend on his deathbed. Make sure they remember there were half Koreans like us. These are the words Becky remembers as she tells their stories. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Would you please welcome Becky?
Hello, thank you for that warm introduction. It's kind of surreal hearing my own words being spoken out loud by somebody else. This is my first time speaking here at the Royal Asiatic Society, and I admit that my heart is pounding. So thanks so much for being here. And I hope that you guys enjoy this just as much as I do. I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint here. As this is also, the Happy Project is very focused on media, video, photography. I will be showing a couple of video clips as well from our YouTube channel. But yes, hello. My name is Becky White, and I'm here to talk about my personal study of identity, mixed Korean race and culture, and how it's grown into something much bigger than I ever expected, and my theories on why this work is important. But first, a foundation I believe should be laid. If you are familiar with what I do, you might already know that I am half Korean myself, born in the United States. And I've been living and working full-time in Seoul for the past 8 years. And I love and greatly respect Korea, which I think is very important for people to know when we talk about these kind of issues. And living here in Korea, I have felt more at home more than anywhere else in the multiple places that I have lived. So the Happy Project, where does it begin? I think a little self-introduction is important. It begins with my mother here, who was born in Korea. And I'm on the left, my sister is on the right. I hope our photo taking skills have improved over the years. My sister immigrated to the US after marrying my dad in the 1980s, and they met in South Korea as my dad was a soldier here. And then I was born a few years later in the United States. I spent most of my upbringing moving all over, and I was a military kid through and through. So the small talk question, where are you from, never has a straightforward answer. I'm never quite sure if they mean, which state are you from? If I don't know what to say in response to that, they always follow up with, where's your hometown? Again, I'm not sure how to respond. Or are they asking me, where are you, quote, really from? And we moved a lot, my two sisters, my parents, the occasional pet, and me. I do have family here in Korea, and the interesting thing, and I think fortunate thing for this work, is that they are still living right by the military base where my parents met. And obviously time has passed quite a lot, but this place is somewhat like a time capsule, and it still remains. It was very interesting when I visited Korea for the first time at an age where I could remember. And I walked down the same streets where my mom used to walk when she was my age, and witnessing her seeing the great changes Korea has gone through in just a short amount of time. I grew up in the United States in many places, the East Coast, the West Coast, Midwest, and Deep South. And all of my experiences were obviously very different based on my surroundings. So the question now that we ask is, why Korea? What brought me to Korea, and why am I still here now? Originally, I had an interest in diplomacy, and things haven't quite gone the direction I expected, but they've definitely gone the way I think they should have. And like Matt mentioned before, I do work now as director and producer for something called the Happy Project, as well as working in music modeling and video production. But why do I tell you all of these things about myself? My history, my background, my upbringing, because it's all very closely tied to something that we call identity. Now, a few years ago, a friend of mine from high school had an accident, and due to head trauma, he suffered memory loss. And it's a very strange experience when you're meeting someone that you joked around with class who can't remember you at all. We talked for a short hour, and he was trying to figure out who I was, and I was trying to do my best not to scare him with stories or moments we shared that he had no recollection of. And when we parted, I remember him saying that he wished he knew who he was. Then he could remember me. Then he could remember our friendship. I walked away from that incident and thinking a lot about him and those who might not have any memory or idea of their past or their history. They may not know who they are today. And some people who feel those missing pieces go to great lengths to try and figure out what is supposed to be there. My friend ultimately did get his memory back after treatment, and we have reconnected. But I believe that the desire to understand your cultural identity is similar in this desire to search for and establish your personal identity. I think it's important to note that I am not a psychologist or a scholar in the sense that I have degrees claiming I'm qualified to teach about these topics. Everything that I'm saying is just my own observation, my own research through interactions with people who are asking these same questions. And for the time being, with the limited knowledge that I have, I've come to this conclusion that identity, though of course extremely layered, if broken down, can be built out of 4 foundational things. And I lump them as this: ethnicity and culture, family, personal, and God-given. None of these are put in any particular order with emphasis of importance in mind. But first, I have written ethnicity and culture, and perhaps ethnicity is a more obvious marker. This is your community, the people around you with whom you connect and relate. We speak the same language, you fit in with us. You have dark hair and dark eyes just like us, well, you're one of us. These physical traits and taught traditions and heritage are symbols of your belonging to a whole. I think this is part of your identity. The next aspect I have written is family. I am a sister. I am a daughter. Who I am is defined through relationships within my family. And your family may not physically look like you. They may not be your blood relation even, but they can be family nonetheless. And that is part of what defines you. Then I think we have personal identity. And this is what you carve out for yourself, the part of you that you discover over time and shape into becoming the person that you want to be. I am a singer. I am a writer. I am what I choose to be, what I develop myself into. These things also become a part of identity. And finally, I have written God-given because that's my own point of view on the concept of spirituality. as part of our identity. I think who we are is defined by something outside of us. Are we part of something bigger, something more mysterious and powerful than just our own flesh and blood? Do we have a spirit, willpower, moral compass? And these things are also part of our identity. And for me, I define that as God-given. Now, the common phrase that we hear from mixed race individuals is, I don't fit in. I don't know where I belong. I'm sure you may have heard this if you speak to any of your own mixed race individual friends. If one of these 4 pillars is disrupted or you are prevented from exploring them in some way, I think we might feel a bit unbalanced. And especially in the case of my generation of mixed Koreans, a majority of us are military kids, and we might feel a breakdown in our ethnicity and culture pillar. Or I consider adoptees who may feel a disconnect in their understanding of their identity in terms of family, ethnicity, and culture. And I know because I've had the same feelings, and I asked myself, what is my identity? What is missing? And it was out of these questions the Happy Project was born. What is my identity as a mixed culture, biracial person? Now, the Happy Project is primarily visual, and we have a YouTube channel where we upload interviews and mini documentary-style videos of all kinds of topics relating primarily to being mixed Korean, and that does actually cover really a lot of things. And that being said, I'd like to first share with you just a quick video that we made about a 1.5 years ago that might explain a bit more succinctly what we do. What is the Happy Project? So it's something that I've actually been dreaming about for a good number of years, and it was born out of this question of identity. Where would you say you are from?
It's this limbo in between 2 worlds now, and you just can't live at one place, right?
But in Kazakhstan, how do you introduce yourself to people if they ask you, oh, where are you from?
They say like, you're probably Korean, right? Because you look Korean. But then
So you didn't like to tell people you're half Korean because you felt like they would judge you more?
They found out I was half Korean. I got the whole, oh, why don't you speak Korean? Why don't you know Korean culture?
And then I quickly realized that I'm still the foreigner.
I started to recognize that I wasn't the only one asking these questions. I wasn't the only one feeling this way. And I realized that there really wasn't a platform or a space where we could just talk about these things, about race and culture and mixed backgrounds and ethnicities and what does it mean, where do we belong, and who are we?
my upbringing in a Korean cult.
You're the half person.
You're on the Korean team or you're on the black team? Now I know how my mother must have felt.
And we're hoping to branch out to all other nations as well. So if you're not half Korean, but you are half one culture and another, you are more than welcome here. And I guarantee you're probably going to relate to a couple things.
I really like to know if there's, for example, anyone who feels accepted here as a Korean.
When we look at our kids and they're half, I mean, for me, that's 2 holes.
We are the Happy Project! It is a mixture of so nostalgic and embarrassed when I watched that. That was such a long time ago. And in a short amount of time, I've learned a lot more. And if I had the opportunity to go back and do those interviews again, I wonder how many more questions and different types of questions I would have asked. But the name Happy may not sound quite PC to some people, which I found to be interesting, that we would take up arms about such a term. Words are words. They are sounds we make to express what we are thinking, to express a concept or idea. And I wanted a vehicle for this concept that didn't have negative history or very specified expectations attached to it, which turned out to be quite difficult to do. Hafu, for example, is a Japanese term. It's used to describe a mixed Japanese person, but I wasn't Japanese. Then hapa is a transliteration of the English word half into Hawaiian, meaning part. And this term has a history all of its own, which we did do a podcast about. And now it's used so commonly, and I can understand why so many mixed Koreans, especially who live in the US or UK, would be attracted to this term. It is, however, very interesting to see how parents of mixed Korean kids today reject the term hapa or honyeol, the Korean term, on behalf of their children. But also I will see many people tell me that they refuse the word honyeol, but have no problem with hapa. It's most curious the feelings that are brought up by certain terms. also revealed to me how little of our history that we know. If we truly understood where the term Hapa originated from, would we so willingly have appropriated it? And there's actually no term used to describe us that isn't racially tinged or has negative connotation. There is, of course, 혼혈, but that carries meaning from mixed blood to mixed breed. And there are other racial slang used to describe half-white and half-black, but the word that most Hafis in Korea use today is 혼혈. And in a way, it's sort of like taking back this word that was used to negatively describe us and then putting our own pride into it. The younger generation accepts it more easily. When I introduce myself to people, the question I usually get is, 우리나라 사람 아니죠? You're not one of our country people, are you? And I follow up with, oh, I'm 혼혈. And reactions vary, from surprise, delight, amazement, caution. Once in a while, I'll get the strange outburst from, your mom betrayed our country. Or, I'm so surprised you speak Korean, you don't look Korean at all. Or, wow, I thought you were just Korean who speaks English well. And I have my own thoughts on this. And it sort of makes sense with such constant outside remarks about my identity, who I am, based very strongly on how I look. It can be confusing. I have to say that I'm very fortunate to have been raised by parents who just love me as I am, which, as an aside, is key to raising mixed kids, I think. So today, though it's been somewhat of a journey, happily I can say I'm just Becky, whatever that crazy mixture of human might be. And in short, the Happy Project is part art, part research, born out of the question of identity. So how did the Happy Project, the blood and bones of it, come into fruition? About a year ago, I was introduced to a photojournalist named Lee Jae Gab, and I went to his final photo exhibition, and I was given a private interview with him. This is from his exhibition 빌린 박씨, which he explained was the name one of his subjects in this photo here used as his last name. In Korean, there is the name Pak, but this man used 빌린 박, meaning borrowed Pak. This is not my real name, I borrowed it. Because he didn't know his father's last name, he wasn't given one. And in a patriarchal society like Korea, your father's name meant a lot. Lee Jae Gab 선생님 spent 30 years documenting the first generation of half-Koreans after the war. And the stories are singularly heartbreaking, powerful, and they spurred me on to actually work into turning my ideas into reality. He told me that one of these men who he had documented for years, this man, who lived a difficult life because of his status as forever half foreigner, never belonging to Korean society, but not able to be anywhere else, this man here in the middle, uneducated, hardened by the hardships in his life, he wrote a letter to the president at that time with the help of the professor, stating all the wrongs the government had done to their own people. Their people who are just 또 하나의 한국인, 다르게 사는 한국 사람, just another type of Korean, just Korean living a different way. And he pled for the government to make these wrongs right. He was never given a reply, and this man here, he died telling the professor, make sure that people never forgot that 혼혈인들, half Koreans, like us, once existed. I told the professor that I was starting something called the Happy Project, and he told me he hadn't photographed anyone for years because of a lawsuit over the usage of his photos. And this broke his trust in people, and he never took photos of people again. Sitting in that cafe that day and talking about his work and the work I hoped to do, I remember him telling me that I belonged to the new generation, that this was not his work anymore, but mine. And that was quite a significant moment in my life. For the first time, I had real validation from someone who saw why this was important for me and for many others, as I would come to discover. After the Korean War, there were many Hafis left over from the American military, results of prostitution, short affairs, sometimes Korean women hoping to escape their difficult life by getting an American soldier for a husband. And when I asked people why half-Korean children were treated so horrifically at this time, well, it's because they were the reminders of the horrors of war. In short, the blatant, living reminder of the government's failure, physical remnants of the brokenness of this country. And Korea, it can be argued, identifies as a homogeneous country. This concept of pure blood was further championed to rally the people behind a singular cause, nationalism, to pull themselves out of their poverty and into the country that she is today. The sacrificial lambs, for the sake of the greater good, were the mixed Korean children. And I have to wonder if at that time, if Korea had embraced Honyeol as her own offspring, what would our politics, our art, our writers, our cultural landscape look like today? And more so, how different Korea might be in terms of how we deal with discrimination here. I think it's very key to recognize that Korea is not a singular concept. Korea is not a singular culture devoid of outside influences. I might argue it's quite the opposite, in fact. And this is a clip from an architecture. He's Korean and German, and his main focus is on Hanok. And we went walking through Ulchiro Shijang to point out the different influences that we can see from around the world in the architecture in this small area of Korea.
One right there.
Interesting one, yes, that's a Japanese style building.
Oh,
And
wow.
I don't know if we should say just purely Japanese style. It's the building built by the Japanese, and it's called Okabe building. So Okabe buildings were wooden structures, so they're wooden buildings. But the Japanese plastered it over to make it appear like a massive, like stone-made building. So it's also influenced by Western architecture in a way.
I don't think anyone would walk by and say, like, this is not Korea. You know?
Exactly, like
People would just be like, oh, this is part of
or like
Korea.
a Western style building, like, would you walk by and say, no, this is not Korean, this is not us. No, it's part of us now. So sometimes I wonder why, when it comes to people like us, because we're looking more foreign, we're not looking 100% Korean.
Because we're not
We're
Hanoks.
foreigners. You're not Korean.
Yeah.
So it's something I think about sometimes. So with architecture, it's pretty clear, right? It makes it unique.
The argument that he's making is that we can see it very clearly in architecture, at least in Korea, these outside influences and how much easier we accept those things. But when it comes to people, somehow it gets a little bit harder. Now I look at the Happy Project and I realize how much more it has become to me and to many others, to my complete surprise. My own perspective is growing and it's changing as I dedicate more time to studying, listening, and learning. And that's my hope for anyone who watches our videos or listens to our podcasts. Because the reality is, the only thing I'm really qualified to speak about to you are stories. But I think that's very powerful because stories and conversations move us on a very human level, which leads to realization, to understanding, and then to action. And so I'd like to walk you through this story that I've been exploring of my own and what I've learned. And it's contradictory to give away the plot before the story begins, but I'll share with you how it will go anyway and make a guess at how it might end. There are 3 questions I'm asking, and hopefully we can consider them today. Who are half Koreans? Why do their stories matter on a wider scale than just for personal validation? And what will the future of our stories be? So who are half Koreans? The first generation of half Koreans, or commonly called GI babies, were the results of war and imperialistic power struggles, growing up orphaned or in single-parent households, or literally shipped overseas to the same countries that caused their suffering in the first place. They are the scars of military oppression, not only of Korea, but also by Korea, like with the Lai Dai-han in Vietnam. And then the next generation, we saw more military kids, or sometimes the results of prostitution like seen in the Philippines, or immigration, a mix of the negative and also simply natural changes as Korea grew economically. And then thanks to half Korean celebrities, the mindset about half Koreans took a 180-degree turn. Honyeol were once reviled, and then they were glorified. And this is a short interview with a young family here. And we're talking about the things that she feels people look at her son and how she wishes it could be different.
진짜 중요하다. Sometimes you see people or hear people inadvertently kind of say the wrong thing. Like if somebody says something negative about Hafi children and someone will say, oh, but Hafi children are so beautiful. But I feel like being a beautiful child is not their payment to the world to belong to the world. You know, they belong to the world, you know, no matter what. Now I'm going to get emotional. You know, so people, they have the right intentions when they say things like that, but happy children are so beautiful. He doesn't have to be. He could be the ugliest little thing and he still belongs in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. He could be the ugliest little boy in the world and he will still belong. And I think With the rise of this glorification, especially of white half Koreans that we see in media and entertainment, sometimes it's easy to forget that because we like to celebrate this current Eurasian look. I think by seeing the plight of half Koreans after the war, we can see an important, if frightening, side of Korea's identity that developed over time in the name of self-preservation. This ethnic nationalism, though crucial to cultural preservation during Japanese colonial rule, has had oppressive, discriminatory effects on those who did not fit in the mold. And this is key to understanding how racism in Korea today may be addressed so that the next generation of half Koreans won't face the same things and can be the generation who moves seamlessly amongst a more diverse society. Because the Korea that is to come is not the same country it was before, and we all have a role in shaping the narrative. In the beginning, 혼혈인들 could have been accepted and absorbed as simply 다르게 사는 한국인, Koreans living a different way. But they weren't, and they fought for the right to be called Korean, but were rejected. So in a way, Korea created us, this half Korean quote-unquote problem. But being half Korean is not the problem. And that is something I work very hard to tell the mixed Korean community. It's not wrong being half Korean because somehow that trauma can carry down. And here we have a guest who is Native American and Korean. And her clip was quite poignant for me.
Woman. Or your dad, because you were brought up, you would say, in a Korean style upbringing, you had your Korean dad.
Totally.
Wasn't that hard? I mean, it's already hard being in a single parent home, but especially if your dad doesn't speak English fluently, let's say, and then also, you know, maybe, I don't know how, if your dad ever addressed to you guys about your mixed blood. Did he ever mention any of this? Was this ever
he hated
part
it.
of your conversation? Oh,
He hated
He
it.
hated it.
Really?
He would always say, so just to preface, I used to think all Korean men were strict as my dad.
Mm.
And then I found out my father is like the epitome of strict and tough and mean and everything and unloving and tough love. Like he was just so
like the extremes of all those things that you can imagine, right?
yeah, I think a
That's
white
what
kid
you
would be
had
like,
told
your
me.
father's abusive. And I'm sure he was. In many ways, hands down, he was, right? And he would say things to us like, a full Korean girl would have thrown out the trash by now. A full Korean
What?
girl would, you know, have done the dishes cleaner. And because you carry this half of you that's your mom who's slow and lazy, you're not catching it up quicker. And I think he just kind of regretted that. And he really wished he had married a Korean woman. There were
The crazy thing is that these stories I thought were so rare because I hadn't met so many half Koreans myself growing up. I thought that the traumas I carried were just mine because it was just my family and that's just how it was. But it turned out that there were a lot of similarities between what I experienced and what many other people did as well. Half Koreans were pushed away so much it became inevitable that we became the other. First was outright rejection. Now as time passes, we find we are just not enough to be part of 우리. And then one day, I do hope it will just be implicitly understood acceptance. People do say, why do you talk about this so much? Why are you stirring up trouble? And I understand the sentiment. But until it is implicitly understood, I think it has to be explicitly stated. And that's kind of what we're doing with as much graciousness as we can. We are not Korean, and yet we are. But there is nothing wrong with that. We as a society, however, will need to work harder to understand, and that takes time. It takes education, it takes changes in law and support. So I want to foreshadow our story and say that this is no longer explicitly about half Koreans only. Why do these stories matter? Perhaps I began collecting and sharing these stories for personal validation or even vindication. I was finding my own space. And so many half Koreans have these weighted stories of their own and need someone to hear them. Not just someone, but someone who gets it, someone who's really hearing them. But now we see, with Korea's changing landscape, that these stories are becoming impossible to ignore. The discrimination mixed Korean families face is unfortunately well and alive today. We don't need to look far into the past to see this. In fact, firsthand, this has been felt over and over again during these COVID times. I can't tell you how many times I walked past signs saying no foreigners due to COVID. And I wondered, if I walked into that restaurant, if I spoke to the manager in Korean, if I told them I lived in Korea, but I looked the way that I do, would I have been kicked out? Understanding diversity and multiculturalism is key to Korea's future, whether people like that or not. By openly addressing, accommodating, and accepting multiculturalism, Korea has the potential to grow so much. And sometimes I wonder, will Korea follow in the footsteps of, say, the United States, mimicking not only their economic ideals, but also their inability to address their deep-rooted racism? But the more that I ask and I listen, the more I feel Korea's racism is not necessarily innate. It's not a hereditary hatred of skin colors. Rather, this racism is the byproduct of Korea's nationalism that was manufactured and harnessed to survive. Very unlike from the racism that is at the heart of white supremacy, but unfortunately the results can be the same. And we see that in how half Koreans, and especially half Koreans and immigrants who are not fair-skinned, have been treated. This is Tony. He's one of our earlier guests, and he wanted to tell his story so bad he contacted us first, and I was really glad that he did.
Joke because we stop. It's kind of...
What would be some words? Maybe, I don't know if advice is the right thing to say.
I guess you can say advice. I think being mindful. A lot of people stare. It isn't. Yeah, it's rude, but it isn't coming from. Usually, it's not coming from like a hateful spot. They're just curious. Of course, you're gonna get hurt a lot in Korea. I mean, that happens everywhere. If you're an immigrant to another country, that's what happens. But if you're mindful of it, then it hurts a lot less, and it's easier to just keep going.
That's very good.
Mm. And that's something I do hear quite commonly from our guests is, yeah, I've been hurt, but I don't think it's because of an inside hatred. And I really like to believe that that's true. I am hopeful that Korea as a whole and the government will recognize quickly and act to better the quality of life for this and the next generation of mixed Koreans. And this goes beyond rectification or acknowledgement for the wrongs done, though it could go a long way to healing old hurts. Making the appropriate laws and support for mixed Koreans and mixed families, as well as establishing better education and awareness, is a way towards a more harmonious, diverse society. And then even if you don't care about finding peace among minorities in Korea, think about the economic advantages and cultural flexibility Korea could develop. And finally, who is writing our stories? What will the future of our stories be? Who writes the narratives? A friend of mine, an actor from Trinidad who works in New York City, he told me that literally right now, film studios are racing to write the next movie, the next drama, the next TV series centered around these multiracial stories. But who is the person holding the pen, I asked him. He laughed and he said, who do you think? The people who have had the resources, who have had the power in media and film, who have had the systemic support to have the loudest voice. And I think that's also similar to what we see here. And I worry sometimes that in the desire to write about mixed Korean and mixed race issues because it might seem interesting or worse, trendy, the realities may be glossed over, or the people who actually know what the issues are won't have the chance to speak up. These scripts turn into films, that turn into pop cultural narratives, which turn into what the general public knows. To this day, there are people working so hard to dismantle the stereotypes films have built over decades about people of color. And then there are times when our Korean subscribers ask me, why do you call yourself Honyor? But it always follows up with, you're just fully Korean, so why do you call yourself Honyor? Or, in contrast, you're not Korean at all, and you'll never be. With such disparities of thought about us, you can see why it could be hard to move forward. At this point, our work might not even be about moving forward, but simply to be seen and heard, because that already is being overwhelmed by those so eager to tell our stories for us. Another question I have is, are we just going to be absorbed? I think of the Zainichi, the Koreans in Japan, now vanishing into becoming simply Japanese. But they were there, and they still are, and their stories and their history mean something. In our desire to be Korean, in Korea's race to publicly champion diversity, will we forget that half Koreans like us once existed? So I hope that we can do our work now so that the next generation doesn't have to choose one side or the other, feel rejection or wonder why they don't fit in. The line that connects so many of us is the desire to belong. And we must examine and understand why Korea rejected half Koreans after the war, making these honyeol the beginning of this rush of international adoptions, stripped of country and identity. And as callous as this might sound, in the bird's eye view, we can see it was almost accidentally an experiment. And now we are understanding the results. And it doesn't have to be done again with the refugees from Yemen or Afghanistan, with the Korean Filipino children looking for paternal proof, with the interracial couples hoping to raise their families in Korea. We've seen what happened when Korea in the past rejected those who could have made Korea more diverse and colorful. And we are on a tipping point of history of becoming a very different nation than what it was just 10 years ago. And to become a world leader and role model, we must embrace this diversity, not drive it away. So I hope that we can examine what went wrong and now turn a new direction. Because unlike in the US or the UK or in countries where their entire existence is built on the oppression of others and dismantling racism, where it's much more complicated, Korea has this chance to go a different way. So I hope our stories as half Koreans, the stories from our generations before, it's a tough word to say, but maybe that could just be the sacrifice so that Korea can learn from them and change today so that the future generations don't have to sacrifice either. And the question we ask over and over and over again is, what does it mean to be Korean? I would say in general, Korea hasn't really had to ask this question because unlike us half Koreans whose entire existence may revolve around trying to find this answer, now we as a society have to ask over and over again, making us think again and again and again, requalifying, ever expanding, more nuanced and more complex until we are satisfied with the answer. And the truth is, we may never know what it means in fullness. But what I do know is that it already has grown to encompass more people. And we have to be ready to grow alongside with that. The bad thing isn't to be honyeol. The bad thing is the hate that rises from the fear of the unknown or unfamiliar. And that can be said for anyone who finds himself a minority among many. And the dismissal of differences can be as harmful as outright rejection. It's just extra hard for those who wear their differences right on their skin. So it's important to talk about this openly, and I just want to say, dear Korea, let's talk. And my intent is never to accuse nor garner sympathy, but maybe just turn on a light somewhere. And we can't change history, but we can give comfort and relationship to those who feel unseen today. And hopefully bring change for a more accepting, knowledgeable, compassionate, and colorful future. Perhaps one day the Happy Project will just be ancient history, archives of people. But until that future, I'll work for those stories to be heard. Thank you. Here you can see just a couple links to where you can find our work, the YouTube, the Instagram. We do have the podcast where we do more deep dives. The YouTube, of course, is not the right platform for sharing very long, complicated conversations, but you can find more of that on the podcast. And of course, our website where we have some writings and some blog posts. If you are curious about some places where you can read some more information, because it is interesting trying to do my research. Of course, being in Korea, reading Korean and going to the library has been very, very useful for me. But there's not too much that I can find on all the topics I'm interested in. But here are some things that recently I've been looking into. In case you are interested, you could take a screenshot of this, look into it yourself. Korean American Story is another thing, as Matt mentioned earlier, another thing that I work on, and we're filming more stories there. Of course, Mixed Korean Our Stories is a book you can check out. Zainichi Korean Women in Japan is also a book. And same with the last one, which I'm currently reading right now. So I highly recommend all of these sources if you'd like to learn some more. And of course, you can always get in touch with me at any of the places mentioned above. And I think that's it. That's all I have to say. So thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Does anyone have any questions? You can use the raise hand function or wave your hands around or put a question in the chat box. I just posted some of the RES information there.
Yeah, Any questions that you guys have, I'll really appreciate it in the chat or wherever. Or if you want to ask me separately or privately, then feel free to do that as well at any point. Thanks, Normie. Oh, Korean Filipino stories. Yeah, absolutely. In that regard, we are connected with an organization that's working in the Philippines, especially with Korean Filipino kids and families. And that is some hope that we have to travel to the Philippines. We are, of course, located primarily in Korea now. The intent is to hopefully take the project overseas. COVID did really knock that down for the time being, but we're working to stay connected and have contacts where we would also like to explore and share these stories. So Philippines is absolutely on our list. And Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here. I would also like to say thank you, David, for getting me connected. Big thanks.
Thank you. I might ask a question if I may. It was awesome presentation, by the way. Well done on that. That was really, as somebody says, they're really inspiring. I enjoyed every minute of it. You said, Becky, that when you were talking to Lee Jae Gab that you were part of a new generation, right? And so I wonder, and I hope my question is expressed sensitively, is it easier to be a half Korean now than it was 20, 30 years ago? And if so, what makes that easier, more difficult, or the same? And do you think it might be easier or more difficult 20, 30 years in the future? And I have young children as well that might be going through this. So how does time affect this, do you think, would be my question?
I would just say a lot of it has to do with the growing awareness and just the changing mindsets overall. Absolutely, 20 years ago, even just 10 years ago, I would say being mixed Korean was extremely difficult. I myself don't know what it would have been like 20 years ago in Korea, being mixed Korean. But in the States, for sure, there's already a shift in the way people talk to me. But we've had a lot of people who are from an older generation who write in and say, I wish you would share more of our stories because it was just so different and so difficult. We are at this moment hoping to cover and shed light on those stories so I could give you a better example of what that actually looked like. But it's surprisingly difficult to get connected with people in Korea who are from an older generation. I do, of course, have connection with Lee Jae Gab 선생님, but I've asked him multiple times, could you get me connected, with some of your friends? But they are very, very difficult because of so much hurt that they've had and not willing to reach out to people. But hopefully at some time we'll be able to hear their stories firsthand. All I know is that it was extremely difficult for many people, not just in Korea, but also who grew up outside of Korea. And I'm sure there's many reasons for that. Today, I would say that primarily because of my parents instilling such confidence in who I am, it is a lot easier today. But this sense of where do I fit in is confusing, for a lot of people. So I'm sure there are people who are still struggling with that. But as to the outright dislike and racism that's right in your face, I don't know if it's as prevalent today, but people will still, it will happen everywhere. In the future, that's my hope. Why we're doing the work today is so that this doesn't happen in the future. I can't really predict what your kids might go through. All I can say is that they're just lucky to be with such great parents who can prepare them confidently for whatever might come.
Thank you for the message. That's great.
I guess it's John, right?
Phone.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, John. I think you have a cat in your house. I saw your kitty earlier.
Yeah. I have two computers, and I'm trying to. I'm using my phone like Brother Anthony did, so that you can hear me.
Great.
So I wanted to. First of all, your presentation gave me so many things to think about. But one of the things I wanted to mention was like I've known a fair number of Korean American, well, sorry, Korean Americans, but half Koreans through the local punk scene here.
Mhm.
And quite a lot of them were all singers who had like really especially angry music, I found.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering, like, they were kind of, I was treated as a welcome foreigner in the music scene here, and they were treated the same. And I could tell that, at least with the ones I knew more, this really bothered them. So I was just curious, like, I'd like to kind of understand a bit more about, you know, how they would have felt about this. Like, if you can think of any comment.
Are you saying about not feeling or being treated as foreigner in the Korean music scene? Is that what you mean?
Being welcomed as a foreigner.
Being welcomed as a foreigner.
Like, oh, hi, welcome to Korea, kind of as a microaggression, I think.
Oh, I see. Ooh, yeah, it's such a weird thing. Are you talking about Blacklist by any chance?
Blacklist?
Not Blacklist. Okay, that was just an aside. I have a couple half Korean friends who run that pub.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's a really weird thing. Because on one hand, we know that we don't look Korean, but I think a lot of people feel Korean or really want to be Korean. And
Yeah.
so especially when we are lumped in one category as not Korean, it can feel like being pushed away. But also can be a sense of helplessness too, because I know a lot of half Koreans didn't have the opportunity to learn how to speak Korean. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of like they can't even speak for themselves. Yeah, it can just feel really disheartening, I think, when what's happening outside is in dissonance with how you actually feel inside. And a lot of Af Koreans come to Korea because, at least I know in my experience and many other people I've talked to, because they want to know what it felt like, what it would finally feel like to be among people that I look like and would see me as how I actually feel inside, and then actually come to Korea and realize that people don't view you that way. And so it's kind of like a double injury that can happen. Yeah, I'm not sure what more I can say to that, but yeah, at least for me, I know, and a lot of people that I've talked to, is this sense of why are you rejecting me as Korean when I know that I'm Korean inside, but purely based on how I look. But again,
Yeah.
it's hard because I also know how that feels because I've been on sets where people know me as, oh, she's just Korean. And so they'll stand up for me as they're Koreans and they'll say like, oh, she's Korean, speak to her in Korean. And they'll like kind of advocate for me, which also can feel really weird because I'm also not Korean and you know that. And so it feels like almost like I'm wearing a false face. So yeah, I think it's like two mutually exclusive things and trying to put them together in that sense.
Yeah. Huh. Some of them, actually, a fair amount of them were army brats who grew up like in Yongsan, like going to Seoul American High School and everything. So yeah, I think they felt like they belonged in Korea but weren't included at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, as I was starting to grasp it, it bothered me quite a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to be rejected purely on how you look when you want to be part of, kind of I mentioned earlier, like maybe it was outright rejection. Now
Yeah.
it's not enough to be part of Uri. And it's a
Yeah.
constant daily, the mundane, tragedies of trying to prove yourself. And that I think can be taxing.
Yeah. One of them actually created a punk band called Tiki, even. So yeah.
That's interesting. I'll check them out.
I don't necessarily recommend. They were great live. I don't know if everybody here likes hardcore punk though, so be careful.
Duly noted.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Gonna do this.
So have you, because I know in the past, one of the big problems for half Koreans was the fact that, especially if they had no Korean father, then they could not be entered in the family register, which meant they could not go to school unless some uncle registered them.
Right.
Have you like interviewed anyone sort of from that generation? Or?
There was a case of one woman in the US where she was discluded from the family inheritance because she wasn't on the family registry. As for the schools, yeah, I got a couple thoughts about that too. I don't have it clearly able to say it out now with the school. But I mean, if you look into Yongsan military base, that was one of the schools that first accepted half Korean kids, but that school is shut down now. And then there are, of course, some schools, I think the singer Lee Suni, she has one as well, where it's primarily for mixed Korean kids. But I don't know if that's helping or hurting at this point. I'm not really sure. It would be great if we could, you know, have mixed kids just and Korean kids studying together. But that's going to take a lot of effort on the Korean society side as opposed to, you know, the mixed families. Yeah, and then of course, as for having the paternal lineage proof, this does cause a lot of trouble, especially for kids who are born in the Philippines, for example. There are some outstanding cases right now where these Korean Filipino boys are trying to get their Korean citizenship that they feel is their due right, but they're not able to prove paternity. And the Korean law is protecting more the Korean side. And so they're kind of in limbo at this moment. But there are more cases than I know of, for sure.
There's another question in the chat box there.
Oh, okay. From, let me see. Matthias, first of all, thank you so much. And Elise, could you talk a little bit about the kind of work you do to make your livelihood? How your career background illuminates your reasons for pursuing this project. Also, with whom do you work in terms of doing the filming and interviews? Do the editing yourself? Okay. Right, yeah. Well, actually, I originally was really into music and theater. Everyone expected I would hit up Broadway instead of going to university. I went a totally different direction because I wanted to change the world. And so I was like, I'm going to do diplomacy and I'm going to be a nurse in war zones. I just was, you know, young and wanted to change the whole world. So kind of fell into modeling here in Korea. Music is just my first love. And I do voice acting. It's something that I feel like I'm good at. And so the work that I do to make money are things that I enjoy, thankfully. And actually, I fund everything we do for the Happy Project. It's totally from my pocket, which hopefully will change one day. But I have no problem doing that. So the rest of my work is really, honestly, yeah, to make a livelihood, what I like to do, and also to further the Happy Project. I wouldn't say that those works illuminate my reason for pursuing the Happy Project. The Happy Project is more personal than just making money. As for my work, who does the filming of the interviews, I do have a team that backs me up. And they're, of course, nobody's paid. There's 4 individuals total plus myself. So I guess that makes 5. And we all have a lot of varied backgrounds. We have one guy, he's also half Korean. We have another one who's Korean American. We have one who's Korean adoptee from Norway. And then one guy, he's American. He's married to a Korean woman. And he didn't know anything about Korean culture whatsoever when they inevitably got pregnant. And so he kind of stumbled across the Happy Project to learn more. And so they do this purely out of their own passion and also because they care about this. And so I'm very, very fortunate to have met this team. And as for editing, at this point, yeah, I do all the editing myself. But if you see some of our earlier work, that might have been one of our other teammates. But I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear, like, you do this all by yourself? Because at the moment, we're all scattered. So it is me, and then at the moment, me, and then my fiance who handle the bulk of the work. But we're trying to do our best. That's Elise. Jeffrey, my coworker in the UK, his cousin moved to Japan a long time ago. Married a Japanese woman. His daughter is also Becky. Oh, I've actually heard of her. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for these great questions. I really appreciate it. I'm surprised anyone has any interest whatsoever. I'm always shocked when we hear that people actually tune into our podcast. So I'm really very grateful.
Do we have any more questions? Well, I remember there was another lecture vaguely on this topic many years ago, in which the presenter shared this really interesting video on YouTube, and I think it was maybe a Hana Bank ad or something, and it's no longer on YouTube, unfortunately, because it was kind of fascinating. But It was talking about, Tamunhua children and saying he's just like you, he likes kimchi. He says Daehan Minguk when he watches the soccer team play. He believes that Dokdo is Korean. He likes Isun Shin. He will pay taxes one day and go to the army. And I just thought it was kind of odd because the markers of identity all just seemed to be essentially just being a Korean citizen. It was just kind of limited to that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question that we're always asking. Like, what makes you Korean? How are you Korean? How do you know you're Korean? And I guess a lot of half Korean kids are constantly trying to tick off those boxes. And it almost feels like even within the half Korean community, there's like a range of you're more Korean, you're more half Korean than the rest of us because, oh, well, you speak Korean? Well, then you're more Korean than the rest of us. You like to cook Korean food? Oh, well, then you're more Korean. And those who don't tick off enough boxes, even internally, there can be some, dissonance and disconnect. And that was actually a big reason why we started branching out from topics of just focusing primarily on being half Korean and really doing history deep dives and trying to talk about things like nunchi and Chong and Han, because a lot of people want to be Korean so bad and they fight for that right and they state, I'm Korean, but behind it can feel like a hollow shell because they don't have the language to study or they didn't have the opportunity to learn about Korean history and culture because of either how the family, may have been broken up or were adopted, but still feel this strong desire to be Korean. And so we wanted to kind of bridge that gap. And since we do speak Korean and since we are here, we are able to do this study and then translate it and speak it in a way that people can learn and also not feel put down. Because a lot of times I know from my own experience having a Korean mom, if you didn't know something or you couldn't learn it or you couldn't read it or you got something wrong, it's very, very easy for those parents to dismiss you. Like, you should know this. And so it kind of stunts this desire to study and learn more. And so I thought, us being mixed Korean, maybe we could also help to teach other mixed Koreans so they can feel more connected and understand their history and culture without feeling put down or embarrassed. And so that's something I think is really, really important. And this is why I bring it back to, especially for the next generation, how your parents bring you up or how your family environment is. I think that's really, really key to feeling in connect with your culture. Because I do believe that culture is taught. And if you don't have the surrounding society and community to kind of absorb that culture and just learn it without study, having the parents, at least at home, being part to teach you that culture, I think that's really, really key.
Thank you for the answer. Do we have any other questions?
What is your opinion? Do you feel is the relationship between diversity and social cohesion? Is there some sort of coefficient? Maybe there are some trade-offs, social stability versus creativity, human rights. That's a great question, Jeffrey. Diversity and social cohesion. Oh, yeah. To be honest, this is such a hard question to answer, and I don't know if I'm qualified to make, any kind of big statement. I do think that there may be some sort of trade-off that can happen in terms of, let's back this up. We saw in Korea having a more single mindset about things helped us get through, difficult times in history, and even now with COVID, the mindset that exists here versus what we're seeing in more multicultural or diverse countries or places that have many streams of thought, like in the US. So I wonder too, this is why I wonder like where Korea is going to go, how Korea is going to advance, how Korea is going to move forward. Because Korea is going to become more diverse. And I also wonder, is this social cohesion, as you say, is it going to exist as strongly as it does today? But conversely, say we do lose some of that social cohesion that exists because of a more single mindset, I think that there will also be more creativity. I do really believe that Korea needs to inject more of this entrepreneurial spirit, this more thinking outside the box, these ideas from other places, and that put into this society, I think it will only make it grow and become more creative and hopefully more stable if we're all on the same page of getting educated, you know, and being compassionate. Human rights too, yeah. I mean, that's my hope as well. That we'll be able to show these stories, and when you see somebody and live next to somebody who's different from you, but you see them on a human level, I think that will really change the way that Korea treats immigrants, let's say, or those who look different from them. So it's just a step-by-step thing, and I just think Korea is in a really unique place right now to be able to grow in the right direction, and that's kind of my hope. But I don't know what that balance is or exactly where that trade-off happens. Thanks, Jeffrey. John and Buster and Millie. Seems like kids of multicultural background are treated better if it's the father who's Korean rather than the mother. I even read an article that seemed to say it's easier for children of Korean fathers to claim citizenship than children of Korean mothers. That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure when it changed or even if it has. I'll have to go back and actually listen to one of our podcasts on that one. But if you have a Korean father, your name is on the registry, you can get that citizenship. But I definitely know cases of Korean moms. But in the US or in Korea itself, I'm gonna have to look into that. I actually remember thinking I need to check out what the law is currently in that case. Maybe it has changed. But prior to I think a recent change, yeah, you had to have the paternal proof in order to get the citizenship. Korean citizenship, yeah. It is interesting though when we're talking about treated better if your father's Korean versus if your mother's Korean. At least outside of Korea, I've noticed that if you're raised with a Korean mother, most of those kids that I've run into or the people I've run into have a deeper connection with being Korean as opposed to if their father is Korean. And it's kind of an interesting thing to know. But I just think that's because Korean mom traditionally would just be around more, you know, and have a bigger influence, at least at a younger age, on these kids' lives. But as for in Korea, that is something I'd like to look more into. But yeah, John, Buster, and Millie, I'll look into that and hopefully I can have a better answer.
Any more questions? Oh, Samuel? Oh, you need to turn your mic on.
Hi, do you do any outreach at universities here to come and speak to students? Anything do you do that at all? All right, sounds like you're really busy, but
yeah,
once we get this corona under control, I'd love to invite you to come and speak at my school sometime.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe it's because we do our podcasts primarily in English. This may be why there is a limitation in interest here in Korea at the time being. We do, of course, put subtitles as much as we can. Like I said, I put everything out of pocket, which can be expensive. But it is interesting to note that it seems like government organizations or universities in Korea are not so interested, or maybe they just haven't heard about us. Mm-hmm. Given the opportunity, I would love to speak. I'm not sure how qualified I am to speak at such an academic level, so that's why today I was so nervous. But yeah, I would just really love, especially to speak to students. I think that would just be, I think, a dream come true and also really vital. So I consider, I guess now this is my training grounds. But when COVID passes, if we're able to freely go around and speak like this, I'd really, really love to.
All right, we'd love to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll remember that.
Thank you so much for your talk today.
Thank you.
John posted a link to a Korea Times article.
That's great. Yeah, I'll check out that. Thank you. Elise? I'm always fascinated by, as a mixed Korean American, is how did your parents meet back in the day? You said your dad was in some position in the military and your mom. Everyone is very interested in that. I think that's something that we always ask each other. People are very interested to see, how did you guys end up meeting? Just very briefly, of course, they met by Osan military base, down in Songtan area. My dad was Air Force, and my mom is from a very poor family, and so she was working nearby the military base. She didn't speak any English at all, so sometimes I even wonder how it happened. And yeah, they just met on a double date, dating two other different people, and then my dad just started asking my mom out, which is very sweet. And so they did marry here in Osan, and my older sister was also born here in Korea, and I was born shortly after they moved to the States. I would like to mention that even though I think a lot of times maybe mixed Koreans feel tired of being asked that question because we are asked so many times, I do think it's important that we are honest about it and talk about it, just because there can be a stereotype that exists. I don't take all of our comments to heart that we get. We do get a lot of really nasty comments. But one that I do see is that, oh, are you just the kid of a prostitute? Or just very, very said in a very mean-spirited way. And I think that us being able to talk about this openly, whether that is your case or not, to be able to say it without any shame, at least, and to also make it clear that there are cases, of course, of mixed Korean families that are not military, that are not because of, prostitution or anything like that, and just kind of eliminating those stereotypes that do exist.
Does anyone have any more questions for Becky?
This is your opportunity. This is your chance.
Well, I guess if there's no more questions, I will say thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was very, very meaningful. I did a lot of reading and study for you guys. As always, but I was really thinking, I'm going to be in front of a panel of very academic people, so don't embarrass myself. Thank you for the opportunity. I really, really appreciate it.
Okay, well, I'm just going to make a few announcements here before we leave. The RAS Literature Club will be held on Zoom on September 16th, so 2 days from now on Thursday. We also have a walking lecture, which can be downloaded, which was done by myself, and I will post a link here if you want to listen to it. It also has a downloadable map, so you can just walk around by yourself. And our next lecture, number 1450, will be held on September 28th at 7:30 p.m. and it will be by John Dunbar. John has been part of the Korean punk scene since December 2003, documenting everything with photography and writing. In 2005, he started the punk zine Broken Korea, which celebrated its 15th anniversary in 2020. He is the author of Hongdae Fire, a fiction novel about a disaster that strikes at a concert near Hongik University and nearly wipes out Korean live music. He is general editor of RAS Korea's journal Transactions and a copy editor at the Korea Times. So he will discuss live music venues in Korea using historical data, human factors analysis, case studies, and alcohol-hazed memories. It will examine seemingly frivolous issues people don't want to think about when they're having a good time, such as fire safety, hygiene, integration troubles with the surrounding community, and gentrification, zoning and legal issues, and sustainability. It will explore why Seoul's live music scene has been forced underground, literally, into dingy basement venues. So would you please check out our website and YouTube channel where you can find recordings of past lectures and other content. And that's it. We're glad you came tonight.